All right. Good evening. How are we all tonight? Feeling good. It's been a day. Again, it's been a long week. Hetman is unable to join us tonight. He is otherwise indisposed. He has a medical test coming up that he has to prepare for. It's one of those particular tests. You and I, however, are here and we are live. And tonight we had a plan. I had a plan. I woke up and I was like, I haven't finished prepping content for today. And I don't want to do much work. I think I'll take a look at these React videos and react to them. And that was my idea. Unfortunately, as it so often happens, life intervened. This I found today on Twitter. It was put out today, a couple hours ago, in Israel. No, Bubba, that's just the cat. She's a brat. The cat has started screaming in the hallway, so Avery's quite upset. Go lay down, baby boy. Yeah, you're okay. This article was quite incredible. The whole article is quite incredible, but like some of the initial claims, like the dramatic change of pace and the dramatic change of what they are engaged in is like everything in this article has just torn apart the narrative that has been being painted by pro-Israel outlets and pro-Israel influencers and pro-Israel individuals for the entire year. In fact, for the last 2 years. This is truly one of the most remarkable things that has happened in this war so far, without a doubt. This is incredible, really, when you get down to it. And I couldn't just ignore it. I couldn't save it for another time. This is possibly the most significant thing we've seen out of Israel in the entire course of its recent history. The IDF estimates that within 2 months they will occupy 75% of the Gaza Strip and its 2 million residents. Is the article Google translated? Yes, this article is Google translated. The article itself was translated by a Hebrew speaker, and between the two, they match pretty closely. When I found it on Twitter. According to the army, the concentration of the population will bring Hamas to a breaking point that will force it to return to negotiations under conditions set by Israel. According to the IDF's assessment, Hamas's military wing now has the same number of operatives as it did before October 7th, and it possesses thousands of rockets that are currently unused for use in the future. So let's break this part down, because this is the byline. Like this is just before the byline, and we're already in some crazy territory. The concentration of the population will bring Hamas to a breaking point that will force its return to negotiations under conditions set by Israel. As we go through the article, remember to ask yourself, how, in what way does Hamas care about the population of Gaza? In what way does Hamas need the population of Gaza to be able to prosecute its war with the tunnels? See if that question is answered, because this is apparently the point of this operation, and the methodology that is being used to do this is suspect in a very real sense. Next, we have this sentence, which is also absolutely incredible. Hamas's military wing now has the same number of operatives as it did before October 7th. This means that everything that you have seen over in multiple streams and multiple places and multiple sources over the past years of the devastation of Gaza. Here we have covered extensively the devastation in Gaza. We've covered extensively the nature of the actions being taken in Gaza. All of it has effectively done next to nothing. It is absolutely not effective at all. Whatever losses Hamas has taken, they have repaired. And I bring this up not as a method of celebration. No, the understanding that we have always tried to put forward here is that Hamas is not the ideal post-war Israeli structure. Hamas is a problem. They are vicious. They are violent to Palestinians and Israelis alike. In every sense of the word, Hamas is dangerous. They are not the good guys. So all of this that was ostensibly about combating Hamas has effectively done nothing. This is, I think, contrasted with the plan at place, and we're going to talk about it here. Into the meat of the article itself, the IDF estimates that within 2 months they will complete Operation Gideon's Chariots and occupy 75% of the territory of the Gaza Strip and concentrate its 2 million residents, well, not anymore, in 3 main centers: Gaza City, the central refugee camps, and the Musasi area. According to the army, this move will bring Hamas to a breaking point and an internal governance crisis, which will force it to return to negotiations for release of the hostages under the conditions set by Israel. Hamas has shown very little whatsoever desire to alleviate the suffering of the population of Gaza. I'm not entirely certain what sticking them all in 3 areas is going to do to change that. In any case, whether you feed them or kill them, Hamas isn't going to care. They can fight on. They have negotiated multiple times and functionally agreed to most of Israel's demands, and Israel has walked away from these negotiations. And so we're at this point where this plan is not really like, they're not explaining what the intention is. And it's not as if Hamas, knowing what the intention is, can avoid it. It's just simply that they're not telling them. The next paragraph: the army is having difficulty explaining how the fighting will continue in a situation where Hamas chooses to continue to hold on to power, despite the dramatic steps that Israel is planning, and what the implications will be for the fate of the hostages who are still being held captive. This is the Israeli press. This newspaper is it's the New York Times of Israel. Welcome, Maya viewers. We are going over the most remarkable article I've seen to come out of Israel in this entire war. This is the Israeli press saying that the army is not explaining how their plan works, in what way it works. This is especially true in light of the IDF's assessment that despite the severe damage to Hamas, its military wing is still functioning and includes about 40,000 operatives, the same number as it had on the eve of October 7. In addition, the army claims that despite the fierce fighting that has lasted for about 20 months, the organization still possesses many dozens and several hundreds of long-range rockets and mortars and short-range rockets and mortar bombs. According to the Army's assessment, the organization is not currently using these weapons because it plans to use them in the future. In some areas where the IDF is expected to operate, there is a high probability that the hostages are also being held, the remainder of them, very few. The Army says the fighting in these places will be conducted in a controlled manner, that'll be a first, and in full cooperation with the Prisoners of War and Missing Persons Administration, in order to prevent harm to them as much as possible. At the same time, the Army will deal with the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to the designated concentration points. Currently, about 700,000 Palestinians are staying in the Mawasi area after about 500,000 additional displaced people from the Rafah area were added to those staying there in recent months. I'm certain 700,000 people in an unfiltered camp is a good idea. That's certainly not causing disease and malnutrition problems. 1 million people remained in the northern Gaza Strip and will be required to move south towards Gaza City. The remaining 35,000 will be concentrated in the central camp area, and in particular the Del al-Baha in the center of the Gaza Strip. Tomorrow, being Monday, An American company is scheduled to enter the Strip to distribute humanitarian aid to civilians. This is admittedly an improvement in a certain sense. Israel, by law, international law, is required to see to it that the population of an occupied territory have proper food and medical supplies. And just because they haven't previously occupied the territory in any sense except for the I'm not touching you sense doesn't mean it's not an occupation. So this is Israel stepping up to at least lip service to their requirements under international humanitarian law. If the Al-Qassam brigades are 40K strong, then they've grown significantly. Yes, that's very likely the case, which is one of the things I pointed out multiple times in the past basically 2 years, is that Hamas is probably going to grow stronger from this. In the southern Gaza Strip, in the Tel Sultan area, 3 compounds have been established to distribute food to the residents staying in Mawasi, and another station will be established in the vicinity of Gaza City and will distribute food to approximately 1 million additional residents. That's a lot of food, by the way. According to the Army's requirements, each family that approaches the food distribution compound will receive food in the amount that will last the entire family for 5 days. There's a problem with that already. After 5 days, the family members will be required to return to the distribution point to resupply. The members of the American company will be standing in front of the columns of Palestinians who will come to these stations, and IDF fighters will stand a few dozen meters behind them to secure the distribution and prevent Hamas from attempting to loot the food or the residents from attempting to attack the company members. So this automatically isn't going to get food to families that aren't coming to the distribution points. Also, once people start seeing IDF soldiers in the vicinity of these distribution points, it's not unreasonable to assume that these individuals might decide to not risk being attacked by the IDF. All right, this is one of the paragraphs that is really important. Under the current Chief of Staff, Imal Zimar, who took office in early March, the Army's position was that Hamas had ceased to exist as an organized military arm with a command and control structure, and that in practice, the fighting was conducted by a few squads that independently initiated targeted attacks against the IDF forces. The position that the IDF is now presenting, according to which the organization has a certain functional capacity, is a sharp change from the version that had been prevalent until now, according to which most of Hamas brigades were defeated except for those around the central camps. We've talked about this before, that it was unlikely that Israel's claims that Hamas was defeated was true, and now it turns out that Israel is admitting that that's true. Again, everything in the last 21 months has been for naught. All of this destruction has not resulted in any significant weakening of Hamas. At the same time, since the IDF claims that since Samir has taken office, they have also changed the way the army operates in the Strip. According to senior IDF officials, forces are now using heavy fire and damaging Hamas military and government infrastructure while destroying the tunnels that continue to be exposed over time. Are they? Because you spent the past 20 months telling us about all the tunnels you destroyed and all Hamas fighters that you killed and how you were bombing Hamas out of the hospitals, and apparently that was all for nothing. However, the Army emphasizes that fighting is being carried out under the close supervision by representatives of the Military Prosecutor's Office, because that was so helpful so far, and that all targets attacked since the return of fighting in March, approximately 2,900 in number, have received the approval of representatives of the prosecutor's office while adhering to the rules of international law and avoiding harming civilians. As of today, the Army estimates that for every militant killed, 3 uninvolved civilians were killed. This is a wild contrast to what they have said previously, and this, I would point out, matches what independent tallies have suggested about the number of civilians that were being killed in conjunction with militants. There is a persistent lie that has been spread by people such as John Spencer and now Brianna Wu that the average in urban fighting for civilian deaths to military deaths is 9-1. 9 civilians dead for every one fighter that's killed. This is, of course, nonsense. It's been well established that this is not the case. In fact, I'm going to go bring up the particular article now. The civilian casualty ratio in war has never been fully estimated. The most comprehensive study was done in the late 80s. Civilian percentage of the war remained at about 50% from century to century. And this is not particularized to urban combat. This is particularized across all combat zones. So for every, basically, for every one fighter killed, two civilians is killed, which would make the Gaza situation substantially higher. The number of civilians killed per fighter, substantially higher. The reality is that Israel has they've entered a new phase of that particular ratio. The Army's intelligence estimates indicate that despite local uprisings against Hamas, this is not a widespread phenomena that indicates a civilian coup. At present, according to the Army, about a third of the residents of the Gaza Strip still identify with Hamas, another third with Fatah, and the rest do not identify. Palestinians count as 3/5 of a person. Hardy har har. However, the dependence of the residents of the Gaza Strip on Hamas is still very high for the civilian issues, such as receiving food, fuel, work, and wages. Whose fault is that? The IDF believes that bringing humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip without going through Hamas will harm its economic status and governance in the Gaza Strip, among other things, in light of the damage to the organization's ability to pay salaries to its operatives. And that's the end of the article. And this is comments. What we are looking at is basically the admission of the IDF to everything that the reasonable critics of Israel have been saying for the past 20 months. In truth, Hamas has effectively won a fairly significant strategic victory. They are as strong as they've ever been. Gaza is in ruins. Israel has sacrificed its ability to, by and large, control the narrative on a world stage in a way that is becoming increasingly apparent, especially in Europe and to a lesser extent here in the United States. This is a absolute tragedy. Hamas is not, again, I cannot stress enough that Hamas is not an ideal situation for Palestine. In fact, it's probably the worst possible situation that you can find yourself in Palestine. Additionally, the acceleration of the West Bank settlements and the attacks by settlers on Palestinians is helping Hamas in the West Bank as well. It's weakening the Palestinian Authority, which is ostensibly the government that Israel chose to work with to set up a Palestinian state. It is making it much less likely that the West Bank will be able to be peacefully resolved. This is a disaster for the Palestinians, as on par with possibly the Nakba. Bad video.
On the Western Front there, no. Places like Verdun, win quickly and
bad video. This is a disaster for the Palestinians. It is it hasn't made Israel safer. And that's where we're at. So again, my plan for tonight was to do some light React content, but that wasn't fully possible with this article's release and the IDF admitting that its critics had been right all along. And I take no particular satisfaction at being amongst those people. The things that I have been observing are horrific. It is truly, truly a... This will go down in history as one of the greatest defeats that Israel has ever suffered. And it's entirely self-inflicted. So with that, I think we're going to move on. I have 2 videos for you tonight. The first is from a channel called Vlogging Through History, which is a fairly large channel. He does a lot of React content, and we will be reacting to his React content. It's a Reactception, and to the original content through him. He principally covers Civil War history, which is, fairly interesting. But this is about a reaction to another history channel called The Armchair Historian. They are a history channel / gaming studio, actually. They do a lot of animated stuff. And this is about the First Battle of the Marne, which is a battle from World War I, fairly early on in 1914. And it's typically considered one of the more dramatic portions of the early war in the Western Front. To understand Germany's plans in World War I, you kind of have to understand, at the very least, how their last war ended. So Germany is a fairly young country, all things considered. One of the younger ones in Europe, not the youngest anymore, but one of the younger ones in Europe. And they were founded in 1870, principally out of an alliance forged by Prussia with a number of German-speaking states that today make up the Federal Republic of Germany. And they launched a war against France, and they succeeded rapidly conquering France. France at this time was ruled by Napoleon III. Napoleon III was not Napoleon I in any meaningful way, even remotely. Prussia rather, overtook France and managed to put themselves in Paris rapidly. And then they went to the palace at Versailles, and in the Hall of Mirrors, they proclaimed the German Empire. And amongst the things that they did is they took the region of Alsace-Lorraine. And if you're familiar with European history, Alsace-Lorraine is the region between France and Germany. It traditionally would be traded in between wars between the two nations, or kingdoms as the case may be. And so after the War of 1870, the Germans took possession of Alsace-Lorraine. And this informs their plan for the next war with France. They correctly assume that France, incensed by losing the Alsace-Lorraine, will, at the outbreak of war, launch an offensive into that region to attempt to take it back from Germany. And so with this in mind, and with the understanding that they would have to fight France, one of the most powerful land powers in Europe, and they would very likely have to fight Russia as well, and that they decided that they could not do both, they devised a plan. They would receive the attack by France in the Alsace-Lorraine and defend against it as best they could. Meanwhile, they would assemble 3 armies on their border with Belgium, strike through Belgium down into France's unprotected side where their armies were not, and take Paris and knock France out of the war. This plan was called the Schlieffen Plan. It was dependent upon their ability to move through Belgium. And initially they requested that the Belgians that, could we move through your country in the event of war? And the Belgians, feeling neutrality was their best bet, declined. Now, Belgium was not defenseless, even though they were neutral. The principal defenses they had arranged was a fortress, a thoroughly modern fortress for 1914, at the city of Liège. And this fortress was multiple fortresses designed with interlocking fields of fire, and it was built to specifications that would enable it to withstand weapons up to 400 millimeters. 400 millimeters is big. If you're not familiar with it is, at that time, it would have been amongst the largest weapons ever assembled. Germany was aware of this fortress, and so they designed siege mortars to destroy it that were 410 millimeters big. World War I gets launched, and the Belgian defenders at Liège assemble, deploy themselves in their fortress, and the German armies come. And the German armies stop outside Liège, and they start assembling these mortars. And the Belgians watch, and they watch, and they watch. And then suddenly the mortars fire, and a whole ass tower comes crumbling down. And gradually, over the course of the next several days, the fortress is disassembled brick by brick. The Belgians hold out as best they can, but they're ultimately defeated. Some of them retreat. They rally with King Leopold in the city of Antwerp. And they're joined by the British Royal Marines and Winston Churchill because he likes to feel involved. And then the German armies proceed through Belgium. It's a fairly significant moment for in Belgian and Danish history. They are somewhat brutal in their manner, and they hit the British expeditionary force assembling at the border of Belgium, and they throw it back. And all of a sudden, the French realize they're in deep trouble. 3 armies have suddenly slammed through Belgium and are rolling towards Paris, and there's nothing to do to stop them. And this is the moment. This is the moment that they throw everything they have into a defense against these armies, and they fight the epic battle at the River Marne. And this is what this is about.
Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I've had my eyes on this one for several days now. I saw that about a week ago, the Armchair Historian released a video called The First Major Battle of World War I, the Battle of the Marne. I've been waiting to give his video a chance to get some views, and I don't typically react to videos in the first couple of days, so now is the time. I do want to say up front, I think I disagree with the title of the video, and I'm probably just being nitpicky here, but I don't consider the Battle of the Marne to be the first major battle of World War I. Several weeks before this, we have the Battle of the Frontiers, which actually includes the single deadliest day for the French army and for any army during the entire war, where they lose somewhere between 20...
So the Battle of the Frontiers was that offensive that France launches into the Alsace-Lorraine.
And 30,000 killed in a single day in August of 1914. So it's hard, though, because when we're talking about 20th century battles, what do you really define as a battle? Because in previous years, the Battle of Gettysburg is a 3-day battle. The Battle of Antietam is a 1-day battle. The Battle of Waterloo is a 1-day battle. We get into the 20th century and we talk about battles like the Battle of Stalingrad. That's really a campaign, and that's something that goes on for months. The Battle of, just take your pick. The Battle of the Somme goes on from July till November of 1916. These are really more campaigns that have battles within them. So you could probably make the same argument about things like the Battle of the Frontiers, which is big.
So I see what he's saying here about how we designate what is and is not a battle. And like, I can agree to a certain extent, but a lot of this is like convenience in understanding these events and contextualizing these events. Don't make me bring out the 5 C's. Making these things and illustrating their complexity in particular when battles are concerned can be tricky because the concept around a battle tends to look at the result. So Stalingrad, for example, he's marking this out, takes months, and it's not decided in any significant length of time. It takes a very long time for that course of that battle to be decided. Yeah, Verdun's another example. The Somme another example. Really, what we're looking for is results, and sometimes the results can happen very quickly, and other times they don't. So, like, I can certainly see how we're defining that as a battle, but like, that's really the way you look at it. Is what encapsulates the results, and like, what is a campaign as a series of battles, and like how you understand that in military history really depends on your how much you prescribe to the theory of the operational level of war and how that plays out. And that's exceedingly technical for, I think, a YouTube audience to get into unless they are a military audience.
Basically the entire Western Front over the span of a couple of weeks. So I'm not going to worry too much about that. But this battle, the first Battle of the Marne, as it'll later come to be known because there are other battles that are fought there, is absolutely one of the most consequential wars of the 20th century and maybe in human history, because it puts a stop to any chance that the Germans have of seeing their Schlieffen plan play out the way they wanted to. It's when the French army really saves the Western Front with some help from the British. So we're going to dive into this one today. I have the link.
Hey, another thing while I'm here and we're starting this, not a lot of people know an awful lot about World War One history. If I'm going to recommend anything, like a quick, easy read on it, my recommendation is one of two books, and they're both basically titled the same way. The first one is A Short History of World War One, and that is by Professor James Stokesbury. I like his work a lot. It is a little dated, but in principle, it gets you where you need to be. The second one is The First World War by John Keegan, which is also a one-volume history, relatively readable, very short. Both of them managed to cover the principal events of import in enough detail that you should get a solid handle on what you might want to explore further.
Link down in the description so you can check it out and check out all of Armchair Historian's great content without my commentary. I want to thank Wade in Plainfield, Indiana, who signed up as a patron several weeks ago. Really appreciate that. Let's dive into this one.
Paris is in crisis. The war had seemed so far away, and now it was here. Desperate refugees try to flee the city as cars are strewn by the wayside. A monoplane airplane adorned with iron crosses drops bombs and an ominous message on the City of Lights. The message was as simple as it was alarming. The German army is at the gates of Paris.
It wasn't entirely true that they were at the gates of Paris, but you have to remember there are still people living in Paris at this time who are old enough to remember when the Germans were able to march into Paris at the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. And that is still fresh in the minds of some.
Yeah, the Prussians captured Napoleon III and most of his army and then just rolled into Paris unopposed in 1871, just right straight through.
These people that we're talking 43, 44 years. So if you were 18 at the time of the Franco-Prussian War, you're in your 60s now. So you remember this stuff, and you would have heard about this stuff from family members. But this whole idea of bombers, this is a new thing. You've got not only traditional kind of fixed-wing bombers like the Gotha bomber that the Germans will employ, but you also have the airships like the Zeppelins who are dropping bombs not only on places like Paris, but also throughout the United Kingdom.
In the chaos, a lean, bespectacled man stands resolute. Joseph Gallieni, military governor of Paris in September of 1914, proclaims, "I have received the mandate to defend Paris against the invader. That mandate I shall carry out to the end." In August of 1914...
Whoa, wait! Armchair Historian's animated now. What's up with that? That's new.
Germany faced a long-dreaded two-front war against France in the west and Russia in the east. Thus, in accordance with the infamous Schlieffen Plan, the Kaiser's armies embarked on a bold mission to defeat France in just 42 days.
42 days. You're talking 6 weeks. That's the plan. The idea is that the Russians are big and slow and will take time to mobilize, so you can defeat France like you did 40 years ago. They were able to march in and do it quickly, and like they would do 20 years later, going through Belgium, getting around the French defenses on the Western Front there at places like Verdun, win quickly, and then move all of your armies to the east to deal with Russia. Didn't work out that way.
So yeah, and just to elaborate and expand on this, the armies of Europe at this time, with the exception of the United Kingdom, are all conscript armies. But they have all, at this point, by this time, adopted the concept of a general staff. So Prussia, for example, had invented the concept of a general staff, and this is a standing set of officers whose job it is basically to plan for the nation's future wars. What they understood at the time is, or at least they had much more effective knowledge of at this time than they had in previous European wars, is what mobilization is going to look like, because they, first of all, they had adopted and mass placed railroads across the continent. So the idea would be that it becomes significantly easier to move massive amounts of people from point A to point B by commandeering the rail lines and the rail stock. For some countries, their logistical systems are primarily rail-based today, such as Russia. That is more or less where they kind of arrive at, I think. Is this a concept of, we are going to build this conscription army. People will come, they will assemble at their depots, they'll be equipped, we will move them out, and we know how long this takes because we know the speed at which the railway works. The Germans make a series of assumptions. The first assumption is that they will be amongst the first to mobilize effectively, and that France will, in addition to them, be amongst the first as well. So they will assume that France will be ready to fight well before Russia is. They assume that Russia will be amongst the last because they're slow, they're bad at their jobs. And the idea is that the Schlieffen Plan will allow the Germans to defeat the French before the Russians can even put their army in the field. And based on their system of alliance, they can reasonably assume that the Austrians will be positioned in order to stop the Russians, even if the Russia moves faster than intended. This doesn't work out, and Russia gets their butts in gear fairly quickly. However, Russia's not good at this. Imperial Russia is kind of like modern Russia. They enter the war, they send 2 armies out, and moving through what is then Russian-occupied Poland, and the Germans catch them, and they are able to deploy troops and destroy both armies swiftly. In contrast to how the Schlieffen Plan works out. Yes, different gauges. Russia has a different railway gauge than the rest of Europe, in theory, to slow down invasion.
Unrelenting fury, the Germans struck into Belgium, attempting to outflank the French defenses and seize Paris.
And the Germans didn't want to go to war with Belgium. They just wanted to send their armies through. They even reach out to the king of the Belgians and say, hey, we don't want to fight you. We just want to move our armies through. Can you just let us pass? And the king's like, nah, that's not happening. And the Belgians put up a stubborn defense at places like Liège. And they're able to slow down and bottleneck the German war machine enough to buy some time for the French, but also for the British to get troops over there.
However, the Germans...
I don't know how much I agree with that. Obviously, the Germans would have preferred to march through Belgium without fighting, but they planned for it. Like I said, they build these mortars, and they prep for the attack on Liège. They're going to go through Belgium whether Belgium wants them to or not. And does it make time for the French and the British? Yes. Principally, the force that they meet is the British Expeditionary Force. And I alluded to the fact that Britain is a professional army at this time, but what they are is a very small professional army. The BEF is only 100,000 strong, but they're well practiced and they're well drilled. They a very effective use of their bolt action rifles, very accurate fire, very fast rate of fire. It's very almost a classical army in the sense of the Civil War, where they drill firing drills in order to put out a significant rate of fire. The BEF encounters the British actually at a set of canals and crossings called Mons. The Germans, excuse me, they encounter the Germans, and the Germans sort of hit them in a sort of set of waves. And there's not that many British troops. There's basically 10 divisions, and they get slammed into by 3 German armies. So all of a sudden the British are overwhelmed, and they have to retreat from Mons, and they fly into a headlong retreat that doesn't really end until the Battle of the Marne. And in one of those bits that will confuse you when you're first reading through the conflict, the initial commander of the BEF is a man who goes by the name of John French. British commander, name is French, fighting in France. Take notes, it's important.
Were not alone in taking the offensive. As the Great War erupted, military thinking was swept up by a veritable
Cult of the
offensive.
Yep.
In that line of thinking, an attacking army would prevail over a defensive one.
And even if you're being attacked, you should take the offensive at your very first opportunity. That was the mindset. And that's why, you know, we watch some of these horrible offensives at places like Verdun and the Somme, and we think, why would they do that? Why would they march into artillery and machine gun fire and barbed wire and all this stuff? Well, that was the mindset. That was the doctrine. It started to change as the war progressed.
So in response to the German...
There's a great quote, and I can't remember the exact French general who said it in regards to this. He was fighting in the wilderness, and he wires back a report to Paris. He wires back a report to Paris, and in it he says, "The enemy is to the left of me, to the forward of me, and to the right of me. Situation excellent. I am attacking." And it was just that basically he's in danger of being surrounded, and he's like, I'm going to go attack.
German offensive, France executed its own attack, better known as Plan 17.
And this is the
French armies would strike into Alsace-Lorraine and southeastern Belgium, where they planned to defeat the Germans in a single decisive battle.
That's the Battle of the Frontiers.
Over 2 million troops fought the resulting Battle of the Frontiers, the largest battle in human history up to that point.
So, if he's calling this the first major battle of World War I, why would he talk about the largest battle in human history to that point taking place first? I guess I'm a little confused by the title. I should probably let it go, though.
Yeah, my title tonight says the IDF admits Hamas is victorious, and that is, at least in part, hyperbole. It's YouTube. We got to do crap to get stuff done.
The Entente, the battle was a disaster.
Yeah.
Although the recently arrived British Expeditionary Force under Sir John French mounted a dogged defense at the strategic city of Mons, the far more numerous...
And I want to pause right here and just say that if you want to see some great videos about that site at Mons, my friend Rob, who has a channel called History in Your Hand, does a lot of World War I content, just as I do on my channel, Stories of the Great War. Links in the description. But Rob has done some videos about the Battle of Mons that are definitely worth checking out.
Another one I will point out, and I think it is on YouTube still, from the BBC. Let's see if it's still here. I don't think it is. The BBC made a special, like 3 video episode thing. Oh wait, this is it maybe. No, that's not it. Basically, they told the story of the Battle of Mons in the first episode. It is it's an excellently produced bit, if you can find it.
French troops were soundly defeated. Lesser training, lesser quality weapons, and conspicuous, easily spottable
The red hat and the red pants were not helpful, to be frank.
Military uniforms all worked against France in the early years of the war. Additionally, the excessive offensive spirit of the French army and a lack of integrated artillery support made for a fatal combination. After being mauled by the German army, French Chief of Staff Joseph Joffre ordered a general retreat into northern France. During this great retreat, the French and British fought several rearguard actions and counterattacks as they fell further back toward the River Marne, where Joffre had redeployed his troops using France's extensive railroad system and created a brand new 6th Army near Paris. As September began,
and this is one of the things, there's a lot to criticize Joffre for, but he does some things right here in 1914. And among them is being willing to be flexible and to adjust and to respond to what's going on, and not just being rigid and sticking to what he's doing and sticking to the cult of the offensive. He recognizes the offensive failed. Now this is about consolidating and, you know, making sure that the Germans aren't able to take Paris. So counter that with what we're going to see from the Germans, which is that the Germans under Moltke are going to actually make a fatal mistake. And sometimes people do this in an attempt to try and win and make a decisive move. They make a mistake that ends up costing them the battle.
German cavalry.
Yeah, I don't. Field Marshal Joffre is not necessarily a person I would criticize overly much. I think his name is Chris, in Flogging Through History said, he pulls back the army, he cuts the offensive, and he starts reconstituting his forces. And more importantly, he is calm and decisive throughout this crisis. And it is a crisis. He is calm, he's decisive, he's measured, he knows what he is doing, and he knows what he is about, and he gets down to the business of defending Paris. And it's hard to criticize, you can criticize what happens in the Battle of the Frontiers as silly and stupid. And by and large, I think that's a fair criticism of the Europeans in general. They did not take the lessons of 1905 when they fully saw what the Japanese did to the Russians. They didn't take the lessons of the 1905s seriously, of the War of 1905 seriously, the Russo-Japanese War. The writing was on the wall for this concept of the unrestrained offensive. The machine gun in and of itself just makes these things difficult. Dealing with machine guns even today is something that you have to be taught how to do properly. And it's risky, and it typically tends to be a situation it is a much more discussed tactical problem than most other tactical problems that young officer cadets learn. And in turn, the principal problem that von Moltke the Younger gets here is that he has no real way to figure out what he's about. And by the time he does get really an understanding of what the situation is, and he does this by dispatching one of his adjutants out to the front to each of the three armies involved in the Schlieffen Plan, and they go and he evaluates the situation, and his authority was murky, but he's the one who eventually ends up ordering the retreat. The plan was probably a little too ambitious for the communications technology at the time, and once the Germans realized that the French were withdrawing, they did not fully appreciate the situation they were walking into.
Patrols arrived just 8 miles or 13 kilometers north of Paris. It seemed like the German army may succeed in its ambitious Schlieffen Plan. Despite the promising situation for Germany, the Kaiserreich faced several issues that complicated its nearby triumph. The French army and BEF continuously retreated in an orderly fashion, and German armies continuously failed to deliver a knockout blow. German logistics were stretched thin, as much of Belgium's railroad system lay in ruin, and
this is always the problem you have as the attacker, especially when you want to move fast in an industrialized age of warfare, is that you have to have access to trains and roads to be able to move massive. We've done videos on the logistical aspect of World War I and just the mind-boggling numbers of supplies, of food, of ammunition, artillery that you have to have every day at the front to be able to sustain an offensive.
And adding on to that, it's not necessarily in the same vein that you could, in previous wars, you would see foraging as an option to kind of sustain food supplies, for example. And weapons used a lot of the same ammunition. Lead, you can melt it, you can make ammunition on the fly. Things like that are not nearly an option anymore. You need prepared food. You need regular supplies of ammunition for your rifles specifically. All of these things in massive amounts of tons, and you have to be able to move them on the front. And you can tear up the railroads as you go. You can do all sorts of things to kind of work your way through and stop the offensive from moving forward. And that is one of the principal ways. Throw some railroad tracks, and now you have to repair them. You have to be able, if you have the problem of gauge switching, you have to switch trains and load them. It's logistics in World War I was where you really, really started to have to develop working systems in a much more comprehensive way than in previous European wars.
And he's right. Germany gets bogged down coming through Belgium, and there's bottlenecks with the railroads and with where they're able to move things, and this slows them down.
Armies moved further and further from their supply lines. Additionally, Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke transferred several corps away from France to assist garrisons and screening actions in Belgium, as well as in defense of East Prussia.
And this is one of those moves I'm talking about that is brutally unfortunate for the Germans. If you're a German looking at this, is that he's got the momentum. They're falling back, and so thinking that they're needed more on the Eastern Front, he pulls troops out, and then he also is going to make some maneuvers with the troops as they get near Paris, and those are going to be costly mistakes.
The pulling of the troops was... it's a lot written on the pulling of forces off of the flanking wing of the Schlieffen Plan, which is the wing that was supposed to make the final attack on Paris. When the Battle of the Marne kicks off, the Germans are a rough parity with the French at that time. It's about 1 million in the French army and like 800,000, 900,000 in the German. So, I'm not entirely certain. He pulled the corps off to send it east, to fight the Battle of Tannenberg Forest, or Teutoburg Forest, excuse me. No, Tannenberg. Teutoburg is Romans. And I don't entirely certain that particular corps is going to be decisive. Like that changes the equation that much. And the corps that are in Belgium are securing their supply lines from partisan attacks, for example. One of the reasons that the Germans are so brutal in Belgium is because they would get, sniped by this Dutch dude hanging out in a farmhouse. And so they go and they burn down a village. Not having those in place, you don't get to the Battle of the Marne. You have to retreat. Not sending whether the corps would have made a big difference or not, in the East is kind of irrelevant because the Germans smashed the two Russian armies. But I don't think ultimately, even if you sent all 5 of these corps into the Battle of the Marne for the Germans, you have just barely outnumbered the French. You're out of supply. You don't have a steady source of supply. I don't know if it turns out any different, to be honest. I think once the French realize that they need to fall back and that they need to organize the defense of Paris, the ultimate fate is sealed, because this isn't the whole of the French army. They're assembling themselves as best they can between Paris and here. Whether or not they win the Battle of the Marne, I don't think they win the war really the way they intended to.
And it's going to lead to him being out the door in favor of Falkenhayn not soon after this.
Along with these problems, the greatest weakness of the German army was communication, or rather, lack thereof. The German armies operated near...
Oh, it sounds like something I just said.
...independently from one another, while Moltke was at his headquarters in Luxembourg, far away from the front. There was little to no coordination between army headquarters and the field armies. As the Entente retreated, the aggressive General Alexander von Kluck of the First Army decided not to encircle Paris from the west, but instead reroute his army east of Paris for a multitude of reasons.
Mistake.
As Kluck headed east to get closer to the German Second Army under Karl von Bulow, French command learned of the change of direction through radio interception, air reconnaissance, and a map they found on a dead German officer.
Yeah, initially, for most of the war, a lot, for the first year of the war, really, airplanes were primarily reconnaissance options. They did not engage in dogfights. As the war goes on, they, throw machine guns and repeaters and on these things, and they start flying around. And if you've ever seen a biplane fly, by the way, even a contemporary biplane is like this. They are ridiculous aircraft. There's a And the air show circuit, if you see in Chicago or even here, there's a Team Oracle. It's a red biplane, red and white biplane, and he takes this thing up and he flies it through the air show grounds and across the viewing area, and then he just starts like turning the plane, but the plane doesn't turn; it keeps going straight, and he's just basically throwing this thing across the sky more than he's flying it. Biplanes are highly maneuverable, so like these dogfights were kind of interesting in the first place, but like initially they would go up, they'd see what's what, and then come back down, and then they would like wave at one another. The German planes would pass the French, and they'd wave, and then someone brought a rock, and he threw a rock at the, and then someone else brought a handgun, and the situation devolved from there.
Sir.
Communication and intelligence is everything.
This information provided France with a massive opportunity. The First Army was bypassing Paris, and thus exposed itself to counterattack. Both Joffre and Gallieni recognized the opportunity of the situation. On the morning of September 5th, the fresh 6th Army, under General Michel-Joseph Manoury, attacked east of Paris and into Kluck's left flank. German reconnaissance planes had spotted the army before, but Kluck ignored their warnings, and it...
So yeah, this is I think part of it. I don't know if he's going to mention it, but we'll bring it up now. The British Expeditionary Force almost turned around and gave up. French kind of panicked. And so, like, before this attack comes, Joffre comes to his headquarters and he listens to French, and French is making all these excuses about what he cannot do. And Joffre turns around and says, "This is the battle to save France. I need your help. You've got to come with us." And they do. And then you have this right here, what they'll probably talk about. In order to feed reinforcements from Paris into the battle, they commandeer the taxi cabs of Paris. So this stream of French reinforcements starts heading toward the front, basically ferried in taxis.
Instead moved further south to attack the BEF and French Fifth Army. As a result, 150,000 French soldiers encountered just 23,000 German reservists on the River Aure. Despite the odds, the small German contingent counterattacked with concentrated artillery fire. A day of vicious fighting ensued, but by nightfall, the French surprise attack had been stalled.
I will say this: you're probably not going to see too much in the way of trenches. This part of, because they were showing the trenches there, so it made me think of it. This part of World War I is the fluid, the moving part. This is where you have a very traditional kind of big army movements happening. And it's after the Germans fail to take Paris that you're going to start having what's called the race to the sea, where they're not trying to get to the sea. They're trying to outflank each other, and they're trying to continue this war of movement and outmaneuver. But as they make it all the way then to the sea, then they're going to start to dig in. And this is where you're going to get what's going to define the next 3.5 years or so of the war, which is these trench lines with attacks at key places at key moments.
In response...
Actually, let's find that, because I think it's really interesting to see how the race to the sea plays out. In particular, let's see if there's a map, if I can find. Images. What's this one look like? All right, Wikipedia, you're up. So this is about, okay, Paris is here. The Battle of the Marne is fought in this general area. So after the Battle of the Marne, the Germans start falling back. The French turn around and they try to get around the Germans to attack them on their flank. The Germans are like, screw that. So they turn around and they try to extend their flank out so that the French and the British can't get there. So the French and the British try again and again and again. And you can see the dates here: September 24th, 27th, 28th, October. Each time they would try to push and get past them, and each time they would get outmaneuvered until you end up here back in Belgium, up to the point where it's just too wet to dig on the beach. Basically, they built this entire system of trenches straight to the North Sea.
In response to this threat, Kluck aggressively rushed forces to his left and prepared another counterattack. The morning after, Joffre began a general offensive on a 160-mile or 257-kilometer front from Paris to Verdun, the largest battle Europe had ever seen unfolded, as over 1 million German soldiers met 125,000 British and 1 million vengeful French soldiers.
And understand that this is the bulk of what's available for the British Army at this point. The British Army does not have a large standing army. They've got a very small, very professional force, and they're just going to be obliterated. They're referred to now as the Old Contemptibles, because based on something the Kaiser said about them. But most of these guys are going to be killed or wounded or captured in the early months of the war. And what you're going to have later with this 1 million-man BEF is going to be largely made up of volunteers and then later draftees.
Everywhere.
Yeah, the draftees start really quick for the BEF too. Like conscription in England happens at least by the end of 1915. They need to fill out massive portions of the front that they're responsible for, mostly the Belgian and a good portion of the French area. So they really need recruits very quickly.
Where on the battlefield, advances were paid for at a terrible cost of human lives, while the devastation of industrial warfare was unleashed to its fullest extent. Artillery pounded the outdated infantry tactics of the...
I am not... That's a weird animation. This is nitpicky. I'll stop. The French 75 millimeter that is so iconic from World War I is a very stubby field artillery piece. Very iconic. If you ever see it in person, and they're at some places, if you are in the Midwest, there is in Wheaton, Illinois, a museum for the 1st Infantry Division at Cantigny Park. It around it has a massive tank park, which has a couple artillery pieces. One of them is a French 75 millimeter. It is compared to like modern 777s. It's very small. It's very stubby. So like that was a little bit elongated, I think, in animation. Nitpicky. Don't mind me.
Last century into submission.
Artillery is the main killer in the First World War. It's not disease.
About 70% of all casualties, combat casualties in the First World War, are caused by artillery.
There's a lot of disease later on with the Spanish flu. It's not disease, it's not machine guns, it's artillery.
Steel mercilessly rained.
About 20% is machine guns, so they're not negligible. In particular, one of the things you'll note, like when the BEF is in France, they have 2 machine guns per regiment at this time. By the end of the war, there are 26 machine guns per regiment, and the British wanted more. The machine gun is a very consequential weapon. Not like obviously the scale of what the damage of the artillery does is not at all impossible to ignore, but the machine gun became a very significant portion of infantry tactics and remains to this day a fairly widely used weapon in most infantry formations. For example, you will find a squad has 4 light machine guns in the United States for the Army. That's not insignificant.
Down on unprotected men. The Battle of the Marne was a battle of mobility. However, the speedy battlefield maneuvers faltered in the face of new technologies. Machine guns mowed down exposed attackers. In one episode, an attacking Moroccan force suffered a horrific death toll of 85%. Especially among the French, there was...
I think that's probably a casualty total rather than a death total, because many of those men would have been wounded rather than killed.
A deep cultural opposition against digging in or operating from trenches. As a
Machine guns were used at long range to cover large areas. Yes. So one of the things I think people don't appreciate about being a machine gunner is that it's not as easy as it looks. So like if you hop onto a video game and you grab yourself a machine gun, you're basically just using a giant slow assault rifle in most cases. Machine guns can be used that way, but in reality, they are fired in such a way in most cases that they're used against areas of targets and not people. So, and additionally, they don't fire more or less horizontal. Like bullets don't go horizontally. They do a little curvy bit when they fire out of a gun. But machine guns are typically fired in such a manner that they arc down into an area so that they can get behind bits of cover. It's not, super accurate in terms of like, is this aimed fire? Yes and no. But this is by and large how machine guns are used, is basically you are abusing the elevation of the weapon in order to basically make bullets fall on people.
A member of Joffre's general staff put it, the idea of organizing any kind of defense aroused an almost innate repugnance. Digging into the earth was believed to be a dishonorable gesture.
Yeah, this goes against everything that these men have been raised to believe about how you operate a war. They have grown up with these tactics, and anytime there's a major war, we see it in the American Civil War, we see it in the Napoleonic Wars, we see it in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. The tactics change because of the enemy that you're facing, because of the new technologies that have been brought into play. And this is the early months of the war where the tactics.
So we've talked about this when we talk about Dramini, at least the first chapter of Dramini that I've done so far. We're going to do more Dramini eventually. It's fun. The notion of the levels of warfare, you typically will see three-sided, and the three will be tactical, operational, and strategic. And the way these relate. And then like the more contemporary chart will add things like equipment, personal, and then it'll add geostrategic, and to kind of like interplay the notion between the state and the soldier and you put it into a unified theory. Tactics are much more heavily dictated by the equipment you carry and the equipment that the enemy carries. And this is a very significant relationship in the First World War. What you really have is a kind of a failure to get the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War. It's a trench war. And you can say the same thing about the American Civil War, which becomes a trench war by the end, effectively. Lee's army is rousted out of trenches before the surrender of at Appomattox. And there's like a particular irony to this, because like if the United States, for example, is viewed as a backwater in the 1860s, 70s, and even now in the early 20th century, is viewed as a backwater. So the Europeans dismiss the American experience in the Civil War as not being pertinent to them. And in addition, they dismiss the Russo-Japanese War, on the other hand, as the Japanese are Asian and not, not European. It's basically blank racism, and Russia kind of gets included in there too. It's basically blank racism. They say it's not pertinent to European armies. The reality is that Japan had the right of it, and Russia had the right of it. They're building trenches. They're using machine guns. The primacy of war had gone to the defensive even then.
Are not adjusted to fit the nature of the war yet.
During the battle, the men proved as cruel as the weapons they wielded. When a battalion of Germans surrendered by waving a white flag, the pursuing French soldiers kept up fire, resulting in the deaths of 450 men. Near Paris, Kluck's First Army was locked in a fierce battle with Mannerey's 6th. In what would become one of the most iconic events of the entire battle, General Gallieni responded to the emerging threat by requisitioning around 600 Parisian taxicabs to quickly reinforce.
To be fair, they had the Franco-Prussian War at the same time as the Civil War. The Franco-Prussian War is 10 years or 5 years afterwards. And the Franco-Prussian War is not like the Civil War. Like it ends very quickly. The Prussian victory over the French is very decisive. It's very swift. It is not really, like, there's some digging in, but by and large, it's still a war principally dictated by these grand maneuvers that they're talking about. We're back to the taxicabs. The taxicabs in the Marne are a fairly famous story even today.
Force the 6th Army. about 30 miles or 48 kilometers northeast of the city. Although the military impact of Gallieni's tactics was fairly minute, the move did have a deep impact on the morale of French troops and civilians.
The French taxi drivers were noted for kicking their fares out and going, "I have to go to the front," and grabbing soldiers. Like, it was a significantly, it unified the country, and it unified Paris in a particular way. It unified Paris in a very particular way. Like, people want to feel like they're doing something positive in a crisis. And like I described earlier, this is a crisis for France. All of a sudden you have these civilians and these taxi drivers, and they do something that feels concrete to aid this massive battle that is playing out for the soul and the fate of France. This galvanizes the population of France in a very real way. People in a crisis want to feel like soldiers. They want to feel like they can do something, that they can affect the world around them, that they can take control again. And this, in its own way, made them think they could.
Best fight.
As battles raged, French air reconnaissance spotted a decisive opportunity. After Kluck reinforced his left flank to meet the French 6th Army, a 30-mile or 48-kilometer gap between his army and Bulow's 2nd emerged. The French 5th Army, under the command of the hard-headed and aggressive general Louis Franchet d'Espèrey, and the British Expeditionary Force pressed north into this gap, with the prospect of cutting off and encircling two German armies. The BEF, and especially its commander John French, had been hesitant to participate in the battle, but pressed forward after an emotional plea from Joffre. Although the BEF...
I don't think I'd describe it as emotional. Hang on a second. Give me 1 second. I gotta grab... Where is it? Is it close? Oh, it is close. Let me grab... Oh. I'm going to let this play while I find the page.
Did not advance as rapidly as Franchet d'Espèrey and Joffre would have liked. Their push into the gap turned the tide of the battle, as the right of the 5th...
Well, I found that quick. It's chapter 4. This is James Stokesbury's first short history of World War I. He goes over this in some detail. Don't mind me, still looking. Bear with me through the air. He described it really well. Therefore, a tired Joffre went to visit French on the 5th. They met in Melun, 30 miles south of Paris. The French commander put his case slowly and patiently, as would a parent trying to deal in the midst of a family crisis with a fractious child. He said he was about to fight the battle that would save France or lose the war, that he was going to commit his entire army to the last company. He had already issued the order of the day, stating there would be no more retreat. The Germans must be stopped, or the French army must die in its tracks. He could not believe the British would refuse to help at this supreme moment, and he ended by telling French that the honor of England is at stake. The chastened French replied that he would do what he could, and invited Joffre and his party to tea. Page 51 of Stokesbury's Short History of World War I. Like, it is, I don't think, an emotional play. Like every account I have read of that meeting states that Joffre was incredibly patient and controlled and calm.
Fifth Army pinned Bulow at the Battle of the Two Morin. The BEF and left of the Fifth Army pushed deeper and deeper into the gap.
And so you hear there, some frustration from the French with how the BEF are operating. Remember that what we're dealing with here are two completely independent forces. The BEF is not under the command of the French, even though they're trying to operate in concert and they're trying to work together. It's not going to be till much later in the war that you're going to get Marshal Foch, who's going to be placed in kind of the Eisenhower position of World War I for the Western Front, where he's going to be given complete command over all of the Allied armies that are on that front.
Bülow found himself under heavy pressure, with his flanks exposed. While French lines in the east seemed near cracking under German pressure, Bülow was in a major predicament. As fighting continued to rage among the massive front on the River Marne, the breakdown of communication between the German generals and high command became increasingly problematic. On September 8th, Moltke, who preferred to exercise command via an emissary, dispatched a liaison officer.
This guy's old school, and he's not the guy for this, and that's why they're going to replace him. Of course, all of the commanders of these forces are going to be...
Yeah, basically every one of the commanders involved in the Battle of the Marne is in short order replaced afterwards.
Changed within the next couple of years. You're going to go from Sir John French to Douglas Haig for the British. You're going to go through a series of commanders for the French army before eventually resulting in Foch at the end of the war. The Germans are going to go from Moltke to von Falkenhayn to then Ludendorff and Hindenburg late in the war.
This is... Von Falken is, I think, probably better than he's given credit for in the German army. But Hindenburg and Ludendorff they're the duo who wins the battle out east against the Russians, and they very much get to dictate the Eastern Front afterwards. And eventually, like, as Germany is in decline, like, the blockade takes its toll, they are the ones who oversee the final German offensive against the Western Front. It fails, and the Allied offensive takes them out.
Richard Hensch. He was to visit each of the army headquarters with verbal authority to use Moltke's name if redeployments seemed necessary. In the Eastern armies, little was out of the ordinary. After Hensch reported the situation there as favorable, he proceeded...
So, cool little, detail that I'm noticing here. These two guys are wearing what's called the Pour le Mérite, which is the... It's kind of the equivalent of the American Medal of Honor. It's pretty much the highest award you can win as part of the German forces.
To meet with Bülow and his staff. Here, the situation was approaching a breaking point. After receiving news the next morning that enemy troops were massing into the gap in force, Bülow decided to withdraw his forces north, behind the Marne, with Hensch's ascent. Following Bülow's withdrawal, Hensch ordered a highly reluctant Kluck to withdraw as well. 2 days later, fearing that the Eastern Army would be outflanked by the advancing Entente, Moltke ordered a general retreat north. The German failure at the Marne had far-reaching consequences. For a week, the Entente would pursue the Germans, who ultimately halted on a ridge overlooking the River Aisne and dug in. Several frontal assaults by the French were repulsed with enormous bloodshed. As a result of the stalemate on the Aisne, the Entente nations also dug in. Shortly after, both sides would try to outflank one another, digging in during each confrontation.
It's a race to the
From
sea.
the North Sea to the Swiss border, the highly mobile, offensive character of the first weeks of World War I on the Western Front morphed into 4 years of grueling trench warfare. Germany found itself in the one situation it had so desperately sought to avoid. It was forced to fight a lengthy two-front war of attrition. Years after the war, the failure of the Marne...
The Germans are interestingly Francophiles previously. In a weird way, yes. They share a common mythos in Charlemagne and or Charles the Great, as he's called in Germany. And like Verdun is another great example like this. And the Battle of Verdun happens in 1916, and it is the Germans attempting to capitalize on the importance of Verdun to the mythos, because Verdun is where Charlemagne's empire is split up, and you get France, and then you get the Holy Roman Empire as separate entities. And like, we probably should talk about that in some detail later, because I've kind of gone over the place. I do a lot of World War One history. I tend to find it fascinating.
And the Schlieffen Plan in its entirety would become a crucial part of the stab in the back myth. Revisionists and nationalists blamed Moltke, Bülow, Hensch, and even Jews and Freemasons for denying what should have been Germany's triumphant 42-day war. For now, the men at war...
I mean, they weren't wrong in blaming those generals for the mistakes that were made, but the
Hensch is a colonel, or was a colonel at this time.
Idea that it was somehow done on purpose or done to stab the Germans in the back and keep them from winning.
Would have to endure the grueling realities of the trench until almost exactly 4 years later, when another Battle of the Marne would finally break the seemingly never-ending stalemate.
Yeah, and if you are, let this play out. So if you are part of the 3rd Infantry Division in the U.S. Army, you know that the nickname for that is the Rock of the Marne.
The Rock of the Marne.
And that's going to come from that Battle of the Marne in 1918, where the elements of the 3rd Infantry Division are going to make a stand at the Marne River. And once again, that's going to be the place. And that's going to include battles like Belleau Wood, things like that. It's going to be the place that the Germans are going to be stopped during their spring offensive in 1918, where they're trying to win the war. So good stuff. I enjoyed that. He always does a great job with his videos, so definitely check that out. Check out my friend Rob's videos over on History in Your...
All right, that will be concluding that particular part of this evening's festivities. We have another video tonight, also First World War themed, about the same length.
All the time, people tell me...
Brandon F. We will start that in earnest in about 5 minutes. Let's go ahead and take a break, stretch your legs, take some medicine if you need to. The donation link is pinned to the top of the chat if you wish to use it, or if you are viewing this after the fact, it is the very first line in the description. Like the stream, subscribe, hit the bell, do the YouTube things. I am going to go get some water, and I will be back. right back. Hi, everybody. I would like to learn more on World War I. Actually, I think we can probably arrange that. I think Hetman will be into that to a certain extent. So we've talked a little bit about our high school history experience, but one of the courses designed by my last history teacher in high school was a history of World War I, World War II. And it was a semester-long class, and one quarter was spent on World War I, and one quarter was spent on World War II. And that's kind of where I got started with this particular war. Also, Brandon, I apologize, because I know you watch these on occasion. I'm taking this face. I'm sorry, buddy. You never know when it'll come in handy. All right, so this video is the First World War was more innovative than you think. And like, I hate to do this because I know I don't talk to normal people nearly as much about these sorts of things as I should, or talk to normal people ever, really, because I talk to all of you. But like, I don't necessarily know who doesn't think World War I was uninnovative. Generally speaking, wars are pretty innovative. They demand innovation. So, like, for example, if we take the Ukraine war, insofar as the Russians and the Ukrainians are concerned, FPV drones and cope cages and whatnot are kind of like, they are inventing innovation. They are working on with different ways, like new innovative weapons are being developed, new drones, things like that. War kind of necessitates innovation, particularly stalemate wars like the First World War or the current phase of war in Ukraine. Insofar as that goes, I don't know, people get weird ideas about history class, and World War I is kind of like a footnote for most Americans in their high school education, unless they have a specific class on it.
all the time, people tell me that the First World War lacked innovation. And that in particular, the general staffs refused to adapt their plans and their preconceived notions to the novel situation which they faced. That they lacked imagination and were only capable of throwing endless waves of flesh into the grinder for 4 straight years. In short, the old trope of the lions being led by donkeys. But the reality of the war was so much more complex than that. In fact, the Western Front, which is what I'm mainly going to be speaking about today, was an, I would argue, exceptionally innovative field of conflict by practically every measure. And in this video, I'm going to go through just a selection of the countless extraordinary examples thereof. But first, before we do, I think it's important that we understand what we mean when we use the word innovation in a military context. So what is innovation? How does technology function in warfare? Well, it isn't just a slider to adjust or a bar to fill. It's definitely not a tech tree wherein one element...
Hang on, that's the Hearts of Iron tech tree. What country? Hang on, I can figure this out. Oh! It's kind of blurry. But I think he's talking Germany. No. Yes. No. There's no set of circumstances in which you're playing Germany in Hearts of Iron where the Opal Blitz wouldn't be researched. This might be a generic tree.
And just follows after another in a long, spidery line with different branches being separate from one another. In reality, the concept of innovation consists of 1.5 million different factors, both scientific and cultural, that all play off of one another simultaneously, feeding off of and building each other up. It's weapons and medical technology. It's battlefield logistics doctrine and domestic industrial policy. It's everything from a slightly improved way to dig a latrine trench to a new kind of tank. Now, sometimes these innovations are...
I just want to point out that this is the Renault FT-17 tank. This is probably the most adorable tank ever produced in history. Saw action up until the Second World War in China, actually. Very small, lightly armed, but it's got a turret. It's like recognizably a main battle tank of today, just teeny tiny tractorishly.
Big, they're extraordinary, they're famous, they're world-changing.
I developed a particular affection for that tank playing Battlefield 1, by the way. Like, it's a single-person tank, so I didn't have to deal with crew. And you could just go on a tear through a Battlefield game and people didn't know how to deal with it.
And whatnot. And other times, they're only minute. They're little changes that alter a fraction of a part of a larger whole. But still...
Well, obviously, Palm Dad, the Ottomans are an empire mostly full of mismatched furniture.
It's innovation, and it's vital to that whole, whether we see it or not. After all...
So what I think Brandon's getting at here is a concept I've tried to relay in conversations and a little bit here, is that we assign to this a description of what a thing is. So science, for example. What is science? And you're taught, well, science is a scientific method, and it's biology, and it's physics, and it's chemistry. But what it also is a process composed of a set of philosophical ideas that come together to form a set of methods that you can use to invent, to design, to explore, and explain the natural world. And that's certainly part of it. So like when we talk about innovation, and particularly because this is like a political buzzword, innovation is parallel processes, like people making decisions and designing things and working through things. It is a description after the fact of an incredibly complex set of ideas and events, all interchanging at once that we're trying to make sense of. And like this sort of like flattening of it into a political idea, it kind of hurts our understanding of how we create and invent as human beings.
All, to invent the modern-day tank with a 360-degree turret, you first need to invent the ball bearing. And you, of course, need to make sure that the guy who's going to be operating that tank isn't stuck back at camp with dysentery because someone didn't dig the latrine ditch according to the new regulations, as boring as that particular kind of innovation may be to read about, right? In short, innovation is a science, right? And sometimes science can be dull, right? It's technical, it's new.
I will kind of disagree here. Innovation is an aspect of science. It can be the result of scientific experimentation, but it is not in and of itself a science.
Numeric, it's dry. And yet, when you look through all of that, there's also a distinct kind of art, a beauty, I think, to be found even in those most minute of details. And it's to be found in the way that all those details come together to create something else entirely new. Within every science, there is also an art. And you know what's an amazing way to better understand and appreciate that dynamic? Well, conveniently, it's actually through this video's sponsor. This thing that this book has to offer. Now, instead of all on this lovely, fun to sort of flip, it's a fun, it's an engaging way to explore technique. They've a best on Kickstarter. So if you'd like to check out the book for yourself, you can follow my link in the description down below, and of course be sure to use code.
I'll give you one thing, it's a innovative title.
Brandon F10 when you order your copy. Thank you so much to Hungry Minds, creators of the book, for sponsoring this video and reminding us that alongside being important, innovation can also be beautiful. Back to the topic at hand. Of course, we're not here to discuss beauty, at least not in its traditional sense. We are here to discuss the First World War, a conflict which raged over 4 years, and most notorious for its stalemate on the Western Front, where indeed, at first glance, it might seem that both sides of the struggle were simply running into each other over and over again, resulting in countless casualties for mere meters of ground. Yet in reality, while yes, there was a stalemate, It wasn't for any lack of innovation, for a lack of adaptation or imagination, be that on the part of the generals or anyone else. And to demonstrate my point, we're going to look at just a few of the countless examples of innovation, again primarily on the Western Front, keeping in mind what we said earlier about how this stuff works and how every moving part is contributing something to a wider effort. So hold on to your hats, because there's going to be a lot of information here, and we're going to go pretty quickly. One of the most...
Yeah, box magazines are actually like a really, particularly in the context of the First World War, very much an innovation. They changed the way you operate in in a certain sense. Largely, like, you have fixed magazines in a lot of older style rifles, right? And the way you'd reload them usually is either manually one at a time, which is a pain in the ass, or through the use of stripper clips. And I guess the best example of a stripper clip rifle that would be contemporarily thought of is like the SKS. You put the stripper clip into the top of the rifle and you push the bullets into the magazine, and then you pull the stripper clip out. The box magazine makes it possible to quickly reload a rifle without really intervening with your fingers. And it's basically basically almost universal amongst service rifles today, is they have a magazine.
Most iconic developments of the war was, of course, the steel helmet, introduced to the average European soldier, rather than just specialized troops like heavy cavalry, for the first time in hundreds of years, and with new and, dare I say, innovative designs to not only protect the men against shrapnel and falling debris, but also to be light, easy to handle, and of course, capable of being produced en masse. There were also specialized helmets for roles such as tankists and sappers. There were even experiments with full-scale body armor to protect soldiers, although these trials were typically found wanting and as such not embraced at scale. Many powers also experimented with various types of camouflage and portable cover. Now, many of these, like the whole...
It's also probably worth noting that as the war went on, military uniforms changed. Like in the last video, we talked about France's red kepi hats and the red pants, and everyone had basically gone to khaki or dark field grau for the Germans by the end of the war. The camouflage offered by the gray that's a different topic, but the khaki was, at least in the mud, somewhat efficacious.
A fake dead horse or fake tree to cover up snipers and the like didn't quite take over the military world, but other developments like camo nets certainly did, as did canvas and burlap covers or special paints for helmets, all used to break up their shapes and ensure they weren't too shiny to reveal their location to the enemy. But of course...
yeah, I would doubt the efficacy of the cover on the helmet in a real sense. So when you're talking about camouflage, one of the things you need to do, what you're doing is you're tricking the eye, and it doesn't work up close, but what you're doing is you're getting your colors to basically flatten the perspective at range. So certain features you paint dark and certain features you paint light on your face, for instance. You keep them, and that will kind of flatten out your face and make your face not look like a face at range. With a helmet, because of the way eyes work and how we perceive things, the curve of the helmet kind of let you know that people have a head and that head is there, and that it's kind of easy to resolve that shape into a person afterwards. So if you ever see the practice of putting branches in your helmet in like movies and stuff, that is a real thing. People do it in terrain where it's appropriate. And what it does, not so much as make you look like a bush, but it breaks up the circular outline of the helmet so that you are much more able to camouflage yourself at range more readily. Of course, when the ACU first came out for the Army, the first pattern of the ACU, because the camouflage was both forest and desert, it blended into neither, and you could see everyone anyway.
What use is a soldier protected if that same soldier is not capable of action? To that end, small arms and individual infantry weapons saw massive developments throughout the war. It saw the first applications of light machine guns, capable of being carried by small teams of soldiers for immediate infantry support, rather than just relying on the heavier fixed pieces that were always used as more static defenses.
That looks like an American BAR. 19 The BR was a very popular weapon in the First World War. Good at clearing trenches, big, heavy-ish, but lighter than a regular machine gun. Box magazine, by the way. Very popular in World War II. Did a lot of the heavy lifting for most American infantry units as far as light machine guns go.
Relying on the heavier fixed pieces that were always used as more static defenses. Another piece of older technology that came to the forefront in a new way was the grenade, with new bombardier drills alongside new grenade types like the Mills bomb being developed to allow small teams of riflemen and grenade throwers to operate in tandem while clearing trenches. The technique of firing grenades from rifles, with things like the specialized rifle grenade cup, likewise wasn't entirely new to the war, but was certainly far developed throughout it. Another great, if particularly brutal, way to clear trenches that was developed during the war was the infamous Flammenwerfer. What did it do? Well, of course, it werft Flammen, much to the chagrin of any upon its receiving end, and particularly when it first saw use as an...
The flamethrower is a particularly brutal weapon. I don't know how much, like, it could see some significant use throughout the First and Second World War, but like if you're trench clearing, the first thing I would consider is trench shotguns is probably a much more and bringing shotguns into a battle situation in that way for infantry is a new innovation, at least in infantry doctrine and tactics. The flamethrower has a very, like, look at that tank. That's not a lot of fuel. So, like, the flamethrower is going to run out of fuel quick, and it's not like you can just hop back across no man's land and get more fuel. You're basically a 3-second pony.
An entirely new, entirely frightening technology. For those men who preferred to get up close and personal, there were a wide range of tools soon
No, the BAR in World War I is principally used as a heavy trench clearing rifle. It's still heavy. It gets slimmed down in the interwar period, but it's a heavy trench rifle, really, when you get down to it.
Adapted, more so than developed, and employed for trench raiding, wherein men would cut down to the bare minimums of equipment and cover or blacken their faces to remain hidden in the dark before sneaking into enemy lines, not only with bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools, which, incidentally, those e-tools were also a pretty innovative design, allowing every soldier to have one on their person at all times, but also things like trench clubs and even occasionally brass knuckles. So again, not necessarily the most technologically sophisticated approach, but still an adaptive new style of warfare that soon became eminently popular for its brutal effects. But so far, everything that I've discussed here has been individual. What about the way in which these infantrymen, so novelly equipped, were actually being employed? Well, contrary to popular belief, this also saw a dramatic number of changes and evolutions throughout the war. At the very start, infantry assaults were taking place at a large scale, with entire battalions, or at least whole companies, moving as single large blocks under the command of singular officers. Now, that's a very big generalization, I understand, but in very broad terms, the start of the war did see large columns of troops all moving at once. But by the end of the war, we see small units, companies, but also platoons, perhaps even individual squads, all operating under the command of much more junior officers, not a major or a captain, but a lieutenant, a second lieutenant, even sometimes independently operating NCOs. The entire course of the war, then, was more or less an affair of learning how to effectively coordinate increasingly large numbers of men at an ever-shrinking level. Nor were these infantry reforms limited to the scale and command structures of their formations, but also the way in which those formations were spaced, the timing of their assaults, even the intention of those assaults, what they were meant to do and reasonably expected to achieve in this new era of warfare. We go from expecting an offensive to achieve a grand breakthrough of the enemy's line, as they had always aimed in the past, to the development of bite and hold tactics, or most iconic.
Sort of. This is an evolution that really only comes around at the end of the war. And it is a very hard one. Like, you will see the Battle of the Somme or the Battle of Verdun, which are mid-war battles, the love battles, are they still expect dramatic gains to be made that just simply aren't. And it's not until the French mutiny in 1917 that they really start reassessing how they fight and what they intend to see and what is realistic.
Ironically, to the invention of modern-day infiltration tactics, largely through the use of the German stormtroopers. And new tactical
I'm gonna correct here. The stormtroopers that the Germans use, in particular in their final offensive, are a Russian idea, actually. The Brusilov offensive is the first significant use of stormtroopers, and this is an offensive out in the Eastern Front. The stormtroopers were very successful at getting into trenches, doing some damage, but they were very highly dependent on the ability of follow-up troops to follow on. The Russians got half of that equation right in their shock troops. The stormtroopers that the Germans come up with do a much better job, and the offensive that the Germans launch at the end of the war is actually threatens to break the Allied lines because they're able to coordinate much better between the artillery, the stormtroopers, the infantry, and other such objects.
Doctrine wasn't limited to the infantry either. Men like Field Marshal Haig oversaw the introduction and development of combined arms warfare, with these smaller scale units operating directly in tandem with armor, artillery, and air elements.
I don't know if I give that to Haig. It is certainly something the Allies get very good at the end of the war. A walking artillery barrage. They start firing these shells forward, inching forward, and the infantry is advancing at a good pace behind to not get hit by the shells. But this is a very late innovation, like 1918-ish, kind of, sort of, 1917. And it's kind of a timetable more than anything. And tanks, too, like, don't really get effectively used until the end of the war. The very end of the war, and it's a tricky bit, and even up into World War II, it's a very tricky thing with tanks because to communicate with a tank, you basically had to go knock on it, get somebody to open the door, and you shout at them to get a direction. Radios are not a big thing yet in tanks; they're not there to that kind of thing. So, like, the tanks, the Americans, when we come into the war, we are working with French tanks. We don't have any of our own. So, like, we have soldiers following along behind the tanks and basically knocking on them and getting things in, orders in. Like it is an early form of combined arms warfare, and it's very late in the war.
Of that as well, mostly without the use of radio. A lot of it was being done by runners and telegraph wire. Now, when people hear Haig, they think outdated cavalry commander. But likewise, the cavalry shifted their own overall approach to fighting in some pretty big ways throughout the war. Not just being available to exploit any potential gaps in the enemy lines, as had always been the case with cavalry, but also coming to represent rapid response forces that were armed in a myriad of ways, from their traditional sabers and lances to rifles and machine guns and many other means besides. If you're interested in learning more about the specifics there and how, in particular, the British Empire cavalry were being employed on the Western Front, well, I have a pretty significantly lengthed video on that topic already, which I'll link down below. And in those efforts, the cavalry were likewise joined by other elements that weren't quite new, again, but they were certainly being employed in very new ways. These included armored cars and, of course, bicycle troops. Of course, the tank itself deserves some attention here as well, being, after all, one of the most innovative tools really in all of military history. It was born directly out of trench warfare as a means for heavy support to be directly moved over top of deep trenches and over thick meshes of wire. Now, the first tanks were mechanical monstrosities, slowly crawling their way across no man's land, breaking
Very slowly.
down all the time, and brimming with machine guns and artillery pieces and very large crews. But they were soon diversified into all kinds of different models, including most notably the French light Renault tank, which was the very first to introduce a turret capable of rotating a full circle intended to support infantry at speed. And the creation of each of these machines required extraordinary investment and research, as well as production time and resources, all of which might just as easily have been applied to more traditional means of warfare had these technologies not been readily embraced. Now, from the offensive, we can look to the defensive, and trench warfare itself, which, despite its reputation of stalemate, also necessitated a wide variety of innovations. Now, some of those innovations were small, like the periscope rifle, or how, on the British webbing systems, a little series of straps were soon added onto the left side ammunition pouches to prevent their popping open when men would stand along the firing lines, usually with their left side, as such, pressed against the trench wall. Of course, other developments were much more significant, like how machine guns and new light mortars would be integrated within the lines, exactly where they would be positioned to have the best effect and whatnot, as well as the actual system of
Those mortars look very large for World War I, for mobile mortars.
designing and constructing the trenches themselves.
Yeah, the support trench system is a new thing. Like you'll throw up earthworks in trenches in other wars, but this support section and these parallel and perpendicular trenches are very much a new innovation. OPs, observation posts, also a new innovation.
Which soon evolved into highly complicated, sprawling defensive networks with various lines all supporting each other and designed to limit individually the impact of trench raids and artillery fire, while still being capable.
Like by and large, these turns are also an innovation in and of themselves. They're designed to keep you from being able to fire down the length of the entire trench.
Of being reinforced at a moment's notice from all the others should a section fall. And speaking of artillery, its doctrine was also continually evolving throughout the war. For example, through the development and perfection of various different kinds of fire, including creeping barrages and box barrages. But the way that the guns were firing wasn't the only new development that they had in response to trench warfare. The various armies also experimented with new types of shells, like gas shells, or reaching the zenith of shrapnel shells, as well.
So gas shells, I think in particular, are worth noting because that's not initially how gas is employed. So the first battle that of note that the poison gas is used is the Second Battle of Ypres. And this is basically the meld of the French and British sectors of the line. It gets taken over by the British more often. And so what the Germans do is they wait for a good wind heading towards the French and Canadian lines. The Canadians were they play a particular role in this story. And then they just opened up the canisters and let the gas flow across the field and get taken towards the lines. And the French, when the gas cloud rolls up on them, they just break and run. The Canadians have a chemist amongst their number, and he realizes it's chlorine gas. And ammonia will take care of it. So he gets the Canadians to urinate on rags and wear it on their face, and that's how they defeat the gas. And the Canadians hold the line and stay in place and hold the line after the gas dissipates as the Germans come in, basically all on their own after most of their French comrades had fled. And then eventually they develop poison shells because the plan where you open the canister and hope the wind doesn't shift is not a great one. It's a Wile E. Coyote shit, really, when you get down to it.
As with different sizes of shells, and all, of course, being fired at a scale never before even comprehended by the militaries of Europe. They would also mix together all of these different types and sizes of shells to try and figure out what combinations and proportions and timings would ensure the greatest possible effect upon the enemy. Which in turn brings us to gas warfare, another entirely new and particularly dismal system of war. There were multiple different kinds of gas employed by the armies of the Western Front, including mustard, chlorine, and phosphine gas.
All right, it has been 2 hours. I think we're going to call it here. It looks like President Sunday is going live again tonight. In short order, I would send you there, except he's not live yet. And I don't think YouTube lets me send people places yet. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Go ahead again, like, subscribe, hit the bell, use the donation button if you prefer and are able to. And I will see you probably tomorrow for Ultimate General Civil War.